Hi there, everybody, and welcome to episode 265 of The Art of Procurement. I'm your host, Philip Heitzen, and I want to thank you so much for joining me today. Now, if you have responsibility at all within your remit for professional services and consulting in particular, then today's podcast is going to offer you a treasure trove of insights. I'm joined by Helene Laffitte, the founder and CEO of Consulting Quest, and I take the opportunity to dig deep into a number of different areas. For instance, how can we find the right consultant? When should a company lean towards smaller or boutique consultants over big brands? Are daily rates really an effective pricing model? I ask about, what do we do if we don't actually know exactly what we need from the consultants yet? We talk about some of the primary drivers of price in the consulting services category. And then, how can procurement actually add value in this category? Before I go into the interview, I do want to thank Tradov for their support of procurement thought leadership and for sponsoring this episode of Art of Procurement. So Tradov eliminates pain points for business buyers and sellers, so purchasing urgency, unaligned buying and selling processes, a lack of communication and transparency within procurement teams themselves, and difficulties discovering new suppliers. And one of the things that you can do with Tradov is build your own private network or community portal for free. So, for example, you can create a private network within Tradov where your entire procurement team can share information, post thought leadership, policies, processes, and start group discussions. So it's a little bit of a hybrid of LinkedIn, Slack, and a wiki page that brings together all of your team's communications into one place. Now then, when you're in Tradov, you can switch over to the public areas. You're going to join a community of over 250,000 buyers and sellers. As a buyer, you can post your supply needs, and Tradov will notify the best suited sellers worldwide using their AI algorithms. So this gives buyers an opportunity to find new suppliers, receive multiple proposals, and really become better informed on the market dynamics of a product or service that they're buying. And finally, buyers and sellers then have the opportunity to transact via Tradov's B2B blockchain solution. So to join Tradov for free, whether to create a private network for you and your team, or to discover new suppliers for your next sourcing event, just go to artofprocurement.com/Tradov. That's artofprocurement.com/Tradov. Okay then, well, let's go into the conversation that I had with Hélène. And the first question that I asked was actually if she could give a little bit of background, and this is for context for the rest of the discussion, on what Consulting Quest is.
So what we do is we help companies from A to Z in the sourcing process for consulting services, and also we know in a larger scale when they want to organize their consulting sourcing capabilities, they want to work on their best practices. This is also something that we do.
Mm-hmm. So from a career perspective, how come you got involved in the procurement side of consulting in the first place?
So, I worked as a consultant for almost 8 years, but before that, I worked in procurement strategy.
Okay. And
performance evaluation on one category. I was working for a large utility company in Europe. And so I'm pretty familiar with procurement side. Mm-hmm. And when I worked as a consultant, what I realized is that the consulting category was not really managed per se. And so kind of going from there with my experience as a procurement on the procurement side, and my conviction that everything could be measured that comes from my performance evaluation experience, make me think that we might be missing something in the way we handling consulting in large companies. And kind of going further, I started discussing with some executives, and I realized that not only is consulting not really managed, but it's not always utilized on the right project. Okay. I thought there's something here on what is consulting, how is it used, how should be used, so you should use consulting, and last one is how do you buy consulting in an efficient way.
So when you look at the role that procurement plays, the role that procurement can play, I wonder if you could share a little bit about that maturity curve. What does best in class look like in terms of how a company should be buying consulting services versus What are you often seeing?
Yeah, so I usually use an analogy for that. I say, it's just like in a rally where you have the pilot. He's driving the car. He's the one in charge, and that pilot is the budget owner, the business line, however you want to call them. Mm-hmm. And then next to him, there's the co-pilot, and that person knows how the road looks like, where are the potholes, how and when to take the turns. And that co-pilot, this is procurement.
Yeah.
And that's how it should be, in the sense that procurement is, it's the facilitator and the gatekeeper. Facilitator because they are the ones who know the market, they structure the process, they help on the scoping, help focus the effort, and they're the ones who get the right people to the table. Mm-hmm. And they're also gatekeepers because they are accountable for compliance to the processes. They are accountable for the quality of the sourcing outcome. And they also have to keep their eyes on the company's best interest. They make sure that they are clear deliverable, that the contract is good and that the price is reasonable.
Yeah. Yeah, I've not heard the analogy with the rally driver, but it makes complete sense. Like, we're also taking care of all the things that the driver doesn't need to particularly know about, but making sure that it's all taken care of so they can focus on the things that are really the most important.
Yeah. And so this is kind of the ideal situation where they really work hand to hand, and it's the relationship between the client, which is the business line, the procurement, and the consulting is working on the best. Mm-hmm. But this is kind of the best-in-class solution. Yeah. And where you see, collaboration, we heard a lot about, the shift between tactical sourcing to strategic sourcing, being invited to the C-suite table, being a business partner. This is what it is. And for the consulting category, it's even more essential than from other categories. When you can maybe find a workaround that for consulting there's no way around. You have to have that collaboration in order to be efficient, period.
Yeah, and from procurement, I'm sure that a number of folks are listening, and I've had this experience too. Back in the day, I had responsibility for the consulting category, and you would always find, not always, that's unfair, you would often find that executives would go and identify their consultant, agree the deal, sometimes, over a round of golf, and then send the deal to procurement and basically say, okay, you need to sign the contract. And you're kind of left with not a lot of places to go. And that's probably more typical of how the consulting category is bought. So what are some of the things that a procurement professional can do to move towards that collaboration with their business executives versus really just being asked to make sure the contract is in place and make sure the consultant gets paid? This is something that I hear a lot. It's true, and a lot of procurement executives are asking me the same question. I think that there's a few things that you can do. First, I think that the key is to listen. Yeah. A lot of procurement executives are trying to push their processes and their structure to the executive before even really trying to understand what's the need and what's the context of the need. So what I would say is listen, understand what is important for your internal clients, what is not, and help them really define a scope that is clear on what's the outcome and not the means. When you do that, you're already bringing them value. I think this is the key to, getting in the game early is to show how much value you can bring them along the process. Yeah. So the second thing I would say is that you have to offer solid alternatives to their existing, pool of providers. Yeah. So the only way to do that is to know the category, to know the offerings, to understand the price structure, to know the trends, because that's the way you can impress them and bring them really excellent consulting firm that they can work with. And if they're impressed, then you're establishing your credibility. And they will ask you next time they're looking for someone or a new consulting firm. Mm-hmm. And, sorry, please go ahead.
And so the third one would be, and I know I say that all the time, I feel like I'm a broken record, but focus on value.
Yeah.
And I think that, of course, we, as procurement executive, we want to reach the target of savings, and we have that, objective for the group. But here, you have to provide the best outcome for them. This is your target.
Yeah.
And you're buying a solution. You're not buying a problem. You're not buying a good. You're not buying a chair or a table.
Yeah.
And if you do everything right, and if you handle a healthy, sourcing process, and savings and cost avoidance, they will come naturally.
So you mentioned at the beginning, buying an outcome, not a need from a scope perspective. When you have that mindset, how does it change the scoping? Are you bringing in different variables that you may not otherwise have in a scope? Are you constructing the scope in a different way? What does that typically look like?
I think that working on the scope is really an essential part of the sourcing process for consulting. And indeed, what is important is to listen to the executive, understand what's the problem, go back to what's the problem. What problem are you trying to solve? And then understand what outcome they're expecting.
Yeah.
And with that, build an RFP that is at the same time a very, very tight on exactly what we need and not more, but also open to approaches and suggestions from the consulting firm. I think that one of the mistakes a lot of people do when they're scoping is to close the door to some other options and just rely on what they know, what they've seen, or past projects. And I think that's a mistake. I mean, a lot of consulting firms are developing new methodologies. They have very innovative approaches, and you want to really take advantage of that.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I've seen that on both sides of the table now. Having bought consulting, as I mentioned before, but now providing consulting too, is you're often pushed by a buyer to list out your entire methodology of how you're going to do what it is, the outcome that you're going to deliver. And sometimes part of why they are hiring you is because they want you to adapt that methodology based on their culture as you go along. And so it's very difficult to say, okay, I'm going to take step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 4, because a lot of it is determinant on what you find in step 1. And it can kind of constrain your ability to have an impact for them when you have to be really prescriptive in an SOW, I find, in a contract when you're doing consulting, because part of what you're bringing is that flexibility to be able to adapt what you know based on what their environment is.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting to really at the same time you have to open your RFP again. You have to open and really listen to what the consultants can propose and the approaches that they can make. And you can absolutely decide after, when you have a proposal, you can decide indeed I want to do step 2, 3, and 4 and not step 1.
Yeah.
And it's also the job of the consultant to explain why step 1 is so important, if they think it's essential or it's not. But at the same time, I think that the only way to really get the most out of the discussion is to have the right people at the table. Mm-hmm. And at some point, there is the person who will buy the project, which is the budget owner or the business line, and you have procurement who are here just again as a gatekeeper to make sure that they're not going, it's not going on the wrong tracks, and we're still keeping, the best interest, etc. And then you can have other people around the table that are here that can help making sure that you get the best towards the outcome, the solution, which is, again, you're not buying company A. You're buying a solution to a problem that you have. Mm-hmm. And so at some point, engaging in a discussion with a consultant and challenging the proposal on the content, on the organization, on the phasing. This is part of the process. And you have to be comfortable enough with that in order to really get the best outcome.
Right. Now, I want to talk a little bit about finding the right consultant. And you talked about, one of the ways of procurement bringing value is to offer some solid alternatives to perhaps what a stakeholder might be assuming that they're going into when they have a problem that they want to be solved. The first actual question I have related to that is actually challenging whether you need to buy an external consultant at all. Is that a role for procurement to essentially try and at least spur a discussion on a make versus buy versus just assuming that you need some external help?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I think that a make or buy is so underused for the consulting category. And there's many companies have internal consultants and they don't always call them that, but they can call them, excellence center, improvement group, expertise, process owners, you name it. But there are many internal resources that can be available for consulting work. And I think that all the companies should have a make or buy framework for the consulting. And that make or buy framework should start not by make or buy, but, do the project or not.
Yeah.
It's kind of linked to demand management. Is that project strategic? Is it aligned with the, our overall strategy? Will it help us accelerate our strategy? And this is kind of the first question that you need to ask yourself, okay, should I make that project? Mm-hmm. And that procurement has indeed a role in that, in making sure that the executives ask themselves that question. That's the first kind of step. And then there's another step, which is, okay, the project is strategic. We want to go. Can we externalize it? Can we work with external consultants? Does it make sense? And when you're asking yourself the question, you have to understand that when you work with external consultants, you need to have a process have a project that has boundaries. And when I say boundaries, it means that it's clearly defined and independent. So it means having clear deliverables, having a clear deadline, no interdependencies, no waiting for another group to do something. You have to have, making sure that they can do the work without waiting for someone else. And then you have to look at if you have the resources internally to or not to do it. It's kind of the first question: that does it make sense to externalize, and would we have a good outcome if we were to externalize? Kind of the first step. And then there's a second step, which is more make or buy, pure make or buy, which is, are the skills core for the business? Would it make sense to develop that internally? Is there a specific reason why we want to outsource? Because we need a new, it's a very niche expertise, or it's a very specific methodology that has been developed by company A, etc.
Or you need some external validation to some assumptions you may have made internally.
Yeah, you can have that reason as well. That's kind of the political value that consulting brings can get into there, and then you need someone external. You need also to make sure that it will get you something if you accelerate the process. Usually when you get external consultant, it gets faster because they are focused on that project and it goes very fast. Is there some value to accelerate that project? And one point that a lot of companies forget is the IP, confidentiality. Mm-hmm. Does it make sense to work with an external consultant? It's the contrary to the more the merrier, with confidentiality. Yeah. The more people, involved in a confidential project, the riskier in terms of, of confidentiality breach. So I think that it's important to ask yourself those questions and then decide if there's a value to work with external consultants. Yes, the project is strategic and there's value to work with external consultants. Mm-hmm. Or if, yes, there's value, but maybe we can have some sort of a hybrid project with half, internal resources, half external consultant. Oh, no, you know what? We need absolutely to do that in-house because there's some, sensitive IP that is involved and we don't want anyone to know about it.
So assuming that you've made the decision that you want to go external, you want to bring in an external consultant, are there things that would determine whether you should be looking to bring a large consultant to the table versus a small consultant to the table? You may have a stakeholder who's identified one of the big four that they want to bring in, or an expensive strategy house. There'll be times when you can counter that to say, hey, does that really make sense? And there'll be other times you try and counter it, and you kind of by doing so already just completely reduces any credibility you may have because you even suggested a smaller consulting house. I just wonder if there's typical guide rails or projects where you really have to use a larger consultant versus when it's okay to use a smaller one or suggest a smaller consultant.
Yeah, absolutely. There is. If you look at a consulting portfolio, you can kind of rule of thumb say, okay, 1/3 of the project are kind of the top high level strategy projects, and those ones you usually work with large consulting firms, and all the rest is open to some competition. But to look at going back to the consulting firm themselves, I would say that you have large consulting firms tend to have several capabilities that serve several industries. They have a global footprint, and they usually have developed structured, proven methodologies. And so the type of project where they're really good are large transformation projects, PMI, project where you have a global footprint and you want all the different entities to work together at the same pace, and project where you have a board exposure. That's where you need to work with a large consulting firm and you need to work with a brand, right? This is there's no way around.
Right.
Then smaller consultants. So there's kind of two options. First option is it's a thought leader, someone who wrote, a book. For instance, you can think about, the person who wrote the 90 Days book. They have their own consultancy. Or, in innovation, you have the Professor Christensen, who founded a company called InnoSight, and he's kind of the guru in innovation.
Yeah.
If you want to work with their methodology because you read about their book and you read their articles and you think this is the thing that you want to try, you have to work with them because they're the ones who know how to do that. Because the one type of small consultant. And the other one are, what I call niche consultants. So you can work with them on smaller projects, on projects where you need really a depth of expertise that is very high, when you want a hands-on approach. You all know, and we all know that large consulting firms, they're excellent on defining the how.
Yep.
You should do this, but then you're with your action plan and you have to implement. They're not always, even though they're working on it, they're not always the best ones to do the delivery of a strategic project. And if you want a hands-on approach, or if you're looking for a more customized solution as opposed to proven methodologies, then niche consultants they're excellent value for a much lower price. I always say it's like going back to, car analogy. And trust me, I'm not a car lover, but, I love this one. When you go to work, and do you really need to have a Formula One to do the 5 miles that from your house to your office?
Yeah.
Or can you work with your Toyota, right?
Yeah.
And Toyota is just fine. You can have a fancy one. You can have a RS4 rather than, another model, but still less expensive, very efficient, and it will get you where you need to be.
Yeah. Do you find sometimes there's opportunity to break projects up so that you have, your expensive strategy firm doing essentially the strategy work, but then splitting the delivery into, like a different tranche of work, for example, that can be executed by a smaller provider who are lower cost as a way of, not impacting the strategy work, but also a way to, manage the investment that's needed in those consultants.
Yeah, absolutely. I've came across a few companies that do that very efficiently. I worked on a project a few years ago. It was the project was about marketing. They were developing a marketing framework at the company level. So it's a large company. They're based in many countries, and so they worked with a large consulting firm to build the framework. at the corporate level, and they had everything ready. And when they went to implement the solution, they hired small consultancies locally. So, for instance, in Brazil, they looked for a small Brazilian consultancy expert in marketing that could help them do that with the right people that speak the language, but they're familiar with marketing. And that, so in every country, they worked with smaller consulting firms that were local. And I think that, in the process, what was interesting that not only did they get a very good price for the implementation, but also, I think that the proximity and the intimacy was much better because there were consulting firms that were local and familiar with the local culture, as opposed to the big American consulting firm that comes with their, thing, and this is how you do things.
Yeah, and I
think that there's a lot of value in that. I agree with you, and I think in a more general perspective, and not only strategy and delivery of the strategy, I think that when you have a project that is kind of massive to start with, because it's a huge objective for you, I think that what is important is always look at it as a sum of projects and never commit to a very large project to start with.
Yeah.
I think that phasing a project, identifying, steps in the project, and always challenging the consulting firm to keep them on their toes, making sure that they deliver the best at each step of the process is kind of consulting sourcing 101.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so what I always recommend is, for instance, when usually projects start with a diagnosis and then implementation. And you look at a cost-cutting project, procurement efficiency project, that's how you do that. I usually recommend to start with a diagnosis and commit to that phase one, get an estimation for phase two, and then when phase one is over and you have the results, decide if you want to go for phase two or not. If you want to do that yourself, if you want to work with them, or if you want to work with someone else.
Yeah. We even, within the consulting that we do, we insist that all projects look like that, even on the provider side, because, we can do a diagnosis and the delivery, it may be best suited to somebody else. I'd rather tell, our client that, hey, we think that there's somebody better suited because of the, specifics of this project to do, let's say, work stream 1 versus work stream 2 versus work stream 3, then sign up at the beginning and say, we'll do all the diagnosis and then we'll do all the execution, because, I want them to have the best experience possible, but also I don't want there to be any kind of perception that you're just going to find areas to diagnose as problems, because, you're going to get the opportunity to deliver, a phase 2 later. And it's one of the things that, from when you're buying consulting, you got to be really careful of, because some of the providers out there will obviously, they see that phase 1 as just the way to get in the door, and phase 2 is where they think that's where they're going to take their opportunity to make their money.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, and because when we work on performance evaluation of consulting firm after a project, so you go under a project and then you need to evaluate how well they did and share that feedback with them, consultants, but also internally, to make sure that you always know exactly what, consultants, how good they are and what impact they got on you. And as part of the evaluation, we added exactly what you said, which is how do they balance between, the commercial part and the delivery part. Yeah. And I think it's kind of essential in the relationship that you have with, consulting firm as part of the trust that you need to establish, is that I think that, and it goes to both sides, consultants need to understand that they just shouldn't be looking for cash cows, right? What they're looking for are projects, and of course they need to make money, and we're all in the same situation. but at some point, they can only build the trust if they're transparent on that side. Yeah. It's saying, which is, yes, I want to get the next project, but I will do my best on the first one, and then we can decide on the following part. But on the same, if you look at procurement side and executive side, I think they also need to understand that brain picking on consultants and getting them to come to you, explain what they want to do, take the ideas and then implement them yourself without them, it's also pervading the relationship. And I think it's kind of both sides have to really play the game and be transparent and truthful, I'd say, so you can really build a good relationship.
Yeah, trust is so important, so easily damaged in these, because as a buyer you can sometimes seek to maximize, the information that you get from a consultant in a very early diagnostic, where that diagnostic may only have been priced as a way to essentially the consulting firm to help start to build a relationship with you. And if you start to do that, then they're going to be really reticent about how much information and advice they give during that diagnostic, because they don't want to be taken advantage of either.
Yeah, absolutely.
One last question just on finding a consultant. You talked a lot about the bias towards buying a brand. And we've on the show we've talked a lot about reputational protection. It's the whole cliche of buying IBM and everything that comes with that. Like, how if we have a stakeholder who's so insistent on buying a brand rather than buying what would potentially be a much better outcome, what are some of the ways that you can help influence them to kind of move away from that position, or is it even possible to move somebody off that ledge?
I think there are ways. And it doesn't, of course, it's not an overnight success, I'm sure. Yeah. But I think that there's, I think, kind of two main areas where you can really, you can kind of start to change things. The first one is to work on making sure you always have a healthy competition when you have a project. Yeah. Whether you want to work with a brand or not, doesn't matter. And that means, what does that mean in terms of tools and things to do? First, I think that the buyers need to identify for each subcategory or capability or group of capabilities, however they want to organize their taxonomy. They need to have several potential providers, so they can put them, in competition always when they need someone. Even if it's for brands, that's okay, but you need to have different ones. The second way is to also introduce smaller players once in a while, because that will keep the big guys on their toes. Mm-hmm. If you know that the guy in front of you are always the big ones, you won't make such an effort on the prices because they're all priced the same way. Yeah. Well, if you know there's a small one, then you will make your best. Maybe you will look at what team you put in the thing to make sure that you have the right people. If you know they're very, very expert, then maybe you will go back and pick that super expert that you have on oil and gas, and you will put in the proposal, because if it's not there, you won't have the project. So that's kind of the healthy competition part. The other part is to organize independent process. And this one, not only is it interesting on, overcoming that bias, but also it goes towards the collaboration that we discussed at the beginning. It's like working together to get the best outcome. So the first part is, rather than having one person deciding on who is going to do the project, build a small committee with several people, because the chances that they all want the same consultants are pretty low. Trust me. Yeah. So if you have several people, then there will be a discussion, and maybe the big firm will win, or maybe not. But at least there will be a discussion, and they will really, weigh the pros and cons. The second thing is have a very clear RFP that really explains what are the expected, deliverables. Why is that? Because if you have a very vague RFP and it's not clear on, what you expect and how you do the delivery, that will favor the consultant that have a lot of intimacy. Mm-hmm. They will favor those who know you, or who know the people who wrote the RFP, because they talked to him on the phone. Yeah. What you want, if you have a clear RFP, you can invite new people to the table. That will be relevant. And they will just go, and people will say, you know what? I didn't know them, but I like their approach.
Yeah.
And that's the only way to do that. And the last part is you have to define a way to objectively analyze the proposal in a way that is not based on, oh, I like that guy, but more, what is it that I'm looking for? Yeah. What are the things that I want? Did the consultant understand what I wanted? Is he able to tackle the issues? And then, do I want to work with him? And this, if you're able to do that, then you have all the keys to get the best, whether it's that company or another, but at least you get the best outcome.
Yeah. I want to just touch briefly on, the clear deliverables that you want, you talked about it before at the beginning about having a clear scope of work. If you don't have that, then you'll end up negotiating basically an SOW around what you want, because you're kind of making up what you want as you go. And I've again seen that on both sides of the table too, where you kind of, as a buyer, you kind of have an idea of what you want, you kind of have an idea of what the outcome is, but it's not set in stone. And so it's really, really hard for your service provider to write an SOW or to respond to an RFP against something that you're not quite sure what you want. And you'll end up going backwards and forwards and taking so much time on trying to figure that out during the contracting process rather than the proposal process. And, that can create a lot of heartache, because you can have a provider who then feels like, well, I'm kind of pushed into giving the same price that I agreed to during a quoting exercise when the scope has significantly changed. Or on the flip side, you make yourself vulnerable because the price now is 2x what it was before, and you never budgeted that when you got approval to move ahead to contracting.
Yeah, I think that what is really terrible when you work with a consultant is to change most of the scope of work after you have decided on the consultant. Mm-hmm. And for many reasons, and I think both are losing on the losing end. What is important, and I think, again, let's go back to, I'm so that all the time, everything you need at the end is what outcome and what value are you expecting. Yeah. And I think that the best outcome can only come if you can compare proposals that are good. You need to have several proposals to compare so you can decide which one fits better with you. And it's not only, of course, on the approach, there's also, the personal relationship, right, and the human component and blah, blah, blah. Yes, of course. But if you are able to really have a scope of work that is 90%, defined, then you are able to really have very strong proposals, and you know that the one you choose is very good. Mm-hmm. Well, if you have something that is fuzzy, you have out of 5 companies that you bring on, the bid process, 2 will be completely off track because they didn't understand what you meant. 1 will just do something generic because they don't understand, so they do something they're not taking any risk. And then you have only 2 proposals out of 5, which is not a good, right, a good result. Yeah. So I think that really scoping the work and understanding what is it that the client needs really, and sometimes what they express is not what they really need. And again, listening to the executive and be in a role of facilitator to get them to explain what problem they try to solve and what deadlines or milestones they have. This is what kind of should be the structure of your RFP. Mm-hmm. And then the deliverable, of course, I'm not saying that the deliverable has to be defined completely. I think that what is important is to define the objectives, the milestones, and kind of the nowhere around steps in the process that they can go through. I'll give you an example. I worked on an RFP with a company that is in the oil and gas industry, and they wanted to assess the potential of an investment. Yeah. And they had kind of a diagnosis phase, and then they have a implementation phase. But within the diagnosis phase, there was a milestone which was a presentation to the CEO, and there was a date already set, and there was a presentation to do. And so as part of the RFP, we included in the diagnosis phase and a deliverable, which was presentation to the CEO.
Yeah.
And that was the content, and also helping the executive to be prepared, help them repeat and make sure that they could express the things. This is typically the kind of thing that you need to listen to and include. What you can't say is exactly all the details of what you want in the presentation, because this would kind of constrict, unless it's what you asked for, but you have to leave some room to propose propositions and to value that they can bring to the process. That's why, I'm always saying that, but scoping is kind of the key in consulting, but it's also probably the most difficult exercise in the process.
Yeah, you don't want it to be too vague that just gives too much license, but you don't want it to be too restrictive that takes away the creativity of each one of the consultants.
Yeah, and there's a way, when you are not sure about your RFP and you are not sure about, exactly what you want to do, what I suggest often is to go through an RFI process. So you go first as, you say, hey, this is what I want to do. So your RFI is vague, of course, and you say, this is what I want to do. And then you start discussing with companies on what they would suggest and how they would approach things. That process is interesting because it helps you really shape, the scope of work, and at the end you can enter a formal RFP process. I would say it's interesting if you don't do it too often, and you include the people. You include in the RFP process the people that brought you value in the RFI process. Right. If not, we go back to the brain picking thing, and people will just consultants will just stop talking to you. Yeah.
Then you just end up with the most expensive brands that you have relationships with already, or your executives have relationships with already, and as a procurement organization, you can't really influence any of the sourcing decisions that are made.
Yeah.
I know that it's coming up on time to wrap up. I have one other kind of line of questioning I just wanted to touch on, and that's around price. Price in consulting can seem to be a little bit of a black box to procurement sometimes. What influences price in management consulting?
So there's a few things that will influence price, but I think that going back to the basics, consultants are selling their time.
Yeah.
So what you pay is their time and their experience. So when you kind of got that, then you can see that price will be influenced by the type of consulting that you'll be doing. A strategic consultant will not charge the same price than an operational consultant. Usually strategy is more around, and again, it's kind of give you a sense of a range, but you have charging between 3,000, 6,000 a day, depending on the seniority. A senior partner can go up to 10,000 in big companies, and more. And smaller companies, you can find, 3,000, 2,000. But that's kind of, ballpark, that's 3,000 to 6,000. While operation is more onto the 1,000 to 3,000, range. So you'll see that working with a strategy consultant for operations, it does not really make sense on a price standpoint. But that type of consulting influences the price. The industry you're in influences the price. You won't pay the same thing in chemicals than in banking. Obviously, banking is more expensive than chemicals, but this is something that you need to take into account. The seniority of the people that are on the team of the consultants, and of course, obviously the scope and the timeline. Scope, because it's what makes the time, that the consultant will spend on the project, and timeline, because if you are on a very tight schedule, it's going to be more expensive. Yeah. Obviously, then if you have more time, because you can play some other things. So this is kind of the thing that will influence the price. And then there are other things that can influence the price. One thing is when you're looking for very specific skill. And there are not many, consultants out there that do that. Yeah. If you don't have alternatives, then you know that you're probably going to pay a premium. The other thing is if you're in a hurry, again, if your timeline is really short, you probably will have a premium. And there's also a seasonality. I know that not a lot of people play with that, but usually the beginning of the year is more busy than the end of the year for consultants.
Right.
And if you start your project January 10th, you'll probably pay more than if you do that November 10th.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's part of the game. So, and the last part is if you don't want to challenge your incumbents, you might pay a premium. And I'm not talking large consulting firm. I'm saying incumbents, whatever size they are. When you don't put competitions, you taking the risk that you're gonna have a higher.
They know they're comfortable. They're not going to get challenged on their price.
Yeah, but there are ways to kind of work on the cost without affecting the scope of your project. And there's a few things that you can look into a proposal. And I know that people know about the most common, which is travel.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. I think that a lot of companies are trying to work on that and imposing, a cap on the travel expenses. Some of them also ask for an inclusive price that includes travel.
Yeah,
I think this is really relevant.
Additional 20% for travel costs or something. 20,
you're nice. It can be up to 30, trust me, I've seen things. There's also something that is very often hidden in the very little lines. It's some sort of SG&A fees. Okay. That can be up to 5, 6, 10% of the proposal. So this is kind of thing that are usually put there for negotiations. So I encourage procurement people to really use that as it is. But there's other ways that are interesting. First, how many experts are in the proposal and how many do we really need? Some companies became very good at adding a lot of experts, 10% of this, 50% of that. Yeah. 7% of this. And then since those experts are usually charging much higher than the usual principal or, analyst, then it can kind of inflate the price a lot. So you can play on that. Another thing that is very interesting as well is the rump up, rump down. And that means that usually all consultants are not on the project day one, right? Mm-hmm. So you may need them on the beginning, and halfway in the first deliverable, or maybe we just need them at the very end of the project. So make sure that that you have kind of the right people at the right time can help kind of decrease, a little bit the price. And then there are other options. Again, we discussed about the phasing. Phasing the project can be a very good way to make sure that you keep, the price under control. Play with seasonality. If you're not in a hurry, wait until they have no project, and trust me, they will give a very good price. Yeah. You can also introduce success fees. And on some projects, it can be very efficient because it helps you reduce the risk. You reduce the upfront fees, and you align the goals with them. So it also can be a very good way to work on that. But I think that all of this is very interesting, and of course you need to understand how price works. But at the end of the day, how much pressure you put on price will depend on what value the project will bring you. Yeah. What is super important, and you look at kind of different type of projects, but if you look at a strategic project, very high level strategy project, then the value is enormous. But the time you take to launch the project can make you lose a lot sometimes,
it takes you 2 months or 3 months because you're negotiating and you're losing that time.
Sometimes you'd better just, go for it. Yeah. Because you'll be reimbursed tenfold with the outcome. Yeah. But some other projects that are more operational or, that are more, for instance, purchasing excellence type of projects. Here, the value is less obvious. And then here you need to focus a little bit more on, the price and so on. But I think that at the very end, you have to really look at what value you're looking for.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, again, the focus.
Yeah, where the ROI is. If it's high ROI,
Yeah.
don't worry so much on the price. If it's low ROI, you might want to negotiate the price a little bit more aggressively so that your ROI becomes a bit higher.
Absolutely.
One final question. I'd just love your opinion on kind of the commercial model when you think about time and material versus fixed cost or milestone-based payments. I think that we, as a consulting provider, get requests for both of those, and we have our own bias. But I would love to get your perspective on what you typically see.
So I think that most projects can be done with a flat fee or a mix between flat fee and success fee.
Yeah.
I think that there is a lot of and again, if you have a very clear RFP and you have clear deliverables, then you can define, because this is what I want, and I want the consulting firm to commit to the results, not to the time that we'll spend on the project. Anyway, This is what you want. You want them to commit to the results. Whether it takes more or less doesn't matter. This is what you want. So kind of flat fee usually is a very good option. Mm-hmm. Two things though. First, it is not because you have a flat fee that you don't want to know how they structure their price. And I always say that it's important to understand how they have organized and structured their price, the team composition, how much those people cost, because this is how you will understand how you can negotiate.
Yeah.
And also how, if you want an extension or if you adding some part of the scope at some point on the way, you will have to kind of a basis for negotiation. Of course, you always keep in mind the value, but it's important to understand how it works. It's kind of basic, procurement knowledge to know how the price is structured. So this is important to, even if you have a flat fee, to ask the consultant to include in the proposal how they have organized their pricing.
Yeah, so at least you understand it.
Yeah, there are some other projects where you can go for other type of fee structure. The daily rate is interesting when you have a project that is not well defined. You remember we discussed about when you're not sure, you work with an RFI and etc. You may, in some cases, decide to work with a consultant in particular because this is the one you want to work with, but you don't want him to work for nothing. So you can go for a daily fee type of fee structure. But what I recommend in that case is to always have a cap, a hard cap. Say like I commit to X, and I want to be informed when we reach the target, and then we decide if we go further or not. I've seen, and it's not a joke, I've seen one of my clients going for soft targets, and I told him, don't do that. That's going to be terrible. Yeah. He did it nonetheless, and guess what? It was terrible. Yeah. And I think that the result is catastrophic for both, because on one side there's a consultant that is frustrated because he did some work that is challenged now, and on the other side the client that feels trapped because it's way too much for his
right. They're taken advantage of, or they didn't get what they were expecting, or whatever it may be.
Yeah. So I think that working on daily rates is not necessarily a problem if you're very clear on what are the kind of the limits to what you want to do in terms of budget, in terms of timing and so on. So that's an interesting way. And then there are others, fee structures that are interesting that can be performance-based fees or bonus. Mm-hmm. So which are in fact based on how much results the project can bring you. Very often used on procurement projects, for instance, because it's based on savings. There are rarely a full performance fee structure. Usually, it's a mix between a flat fee and performance fees.
Yeah.
And I have an anecdote about that. I'm sure you'll like it. It's when I was working with a big company, and we were working on a procurement project, and we had a few companies that were meeting prices, and I suggested to add a performance-based fee on the project, and so two of the consultants offered a very interesting flat fee, and then based on how much savings there would be and percentage of the saving and so on. And then there was a large consulting firm there that said, "Oh, you want a performance-based bonus? Great! So the price is the same, and if we do good, you pay us more."
Here's a bonus. Yeah.
Okay. They didn't get the project.
Yeah. Bonus and penalty that only works in one way.
So that's kind of the three different. Then there are others. There are other fee structure. For instance, there's an equity-based fee that some startups are using. When they need the consultant and they don't have the cash up front to pay them, they can say, "You know what? I'm giving you X% of my equity to pay for." There's many ways to do so, but the most common is obviously the flat fee.
Yeah. Well, Hélène, I really want to thank you so much for sharing all the advice that you have done on the consulting category. There's a lot, I think, for listeners to dig into if they are buying professional services of any sort, because I think a lot of this really rolls over regardless of professional services, whether it's consulting or others. So I want to thank you so much for your time. And just a last question, if listeners would like to connect with you, or if they'd like to learn a little bit more about Consulting Quest, where would be the best place for them to go and do that?
So they can go on our website, consultingquest.com, where we have a lot of, we explain what we do, and there's a link to our blog that has a lot of articles, about how to buy consulting. And the other way is to connect with me on LinkedIn. Yeah. I'm very, very active on LinkedIn. So if you want to have questions, I love to discuss, even if it's challenging. And so just can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll be happy to answer the questions.
Okay, perfect. Well, what I'll do is I will include links to the Consulting Quest website and to your LinkedIn profile on our show notes page today. And listeners can find that just by going to Art of Procurement. You'll find a search button, type in consulting, and this episode will come up. So just head over to the website, artofprocurement.com, search for consulting, and you will find this episode. So one last time, Hélène, I want to just thank you so much for joining me.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Hi there, I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.